The Triffin Dilemma and Trade Deficits. Hi everyone and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by ainslie.com.au, the home of Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, Ainslie Wealth and the Gold and Silver Standard. Be sure to have a look. Today, welcome back Alex, who's been looking at this concept. It's always great when Alex comes on and sort of goes through a little bit of the background, a bit of the history, because it explains to us how we're in the situations that we're in today. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going very well. History always repeats.
Well, and people say, oh, it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. But this seems to be one of those situations where I'm almost going to say it's just repeating because this is pretty much back in the situation that we're in before. But start us off today. Just explain to us this concept of the Triffin Dilemma, what it means for people who might not be familiar, and why it's relevant to understanding exactly where we are in terms of global trade and currency.
So the Triffin Dilemma was, I guess, something that was coined in the 1960s by an economist called Robert Triffin, but it certainly, he wasn't the one that brought it up as the first issue. It was actually Keynes that brought it up as the first issue. So Keynes brought it up in around 1944 as sort of the gold standard, and the Bretton Woods was looking at being established, and basically said, if there's a reserve currency, there's got to be a way to settle things, or the country whose reserve currency it is going to have to run deficits in order to supply the world liquidity, basically, or money. So in the 1960s, when Robert Triffin actually coined this phrase, was as Bretton Woods was collapsing, which, as you know, was the gold standard. But it was a gold standard with the US dollar still being the reserve currency. So the US basically said, we've got a store of gold. It's 35 US an ounce, which sounds lovely now that we're 10 times that. Oh, sorry, is that right? 1,000 times
Nearly.
that, 10 times that anyway. So because eventually, as the world needs more money to trade and to use the US dollar, gold may not keep up, and as asset prices grow, there's a fixed amount of gold and there's a fixed amount of gold you can mine, so it doesn't keep up. So eventually the system collapses unless there's a way to settle basically deficits. So I guess everyone's been up at Trump for having a go at the deficits and all the, US being in constant deficit to people. But there is a reason that he's targeting that, and it seems to be based around this Triffin sort of paradox that's going on.
And that's a really good point, because I don't think we can all really grasp just how important it is that you couldn't have it both ways, right? And that's the dilemma, I suppose, that Trump's being faced with, because he's in a situation where he's going, well, I want the benefits that the reserve currency status brings, but also I'm trapped, which is why it's a dilemma. I'm trapped in this concept of, or this situation where I'm perpetually in deficits with other countries. But it is by design.
But it's now growing so quickly, as we know, that, their interest bills are getting too high. The Bretton Woods took about 20 or 30 years to collapse. The petrodollar, we're coming on 50 years. So the can's been kicked down the road many times during the GFC, during the dot-com bust. They keep kicking it, and the same thing keeps happening. But the deficits are now growing so big that people are starting to question the legitimacy, I guess, of the US dollar. And that's when it starts to fall down. Just like Bretton Woods, gold standard collapsed when the French sent a warship. It wasn't legitimate anymore. They recognised America probably didn't have the gold that they're meant to have, and the whole system collapsed.
Is this the idea of that you mentioned of the Bancor, like this concept of an additional currency perhaps, or some other mechanism that isn't the US dollar? Because certainly the US has benefited from it being the US dollar up until this point, but because you've highlighted it can't continue forever. It's a problem by design of its own making. Is there a solution somewhere in the history, in the way that Keynes and others looked at it even back then?
Well, so Keynes looked at it and proposed something called the Bancor, which was basically a settlement outside of a reserve currency. So if, say, the US was running a deficit with China, what would happen is the US dollar would cheapen, make their goods cheaper to produce, and the Bancor would adjust. So the US would be paying into the Bancor penalties because they're running deficits. So say they're paying interest, and China would be benefiting because they've deposited more into the world market. But eventually, how that changes is that the US dollar would depreciate, China's currency would appreciate, and then hopefully deficits get back to zero. So it was a way that Keynes proposed to get deficits to zero.
And I don't think it's necessarily fair when you hear a lot of the rhetoric, particularly around what Trump is saying, that, people have been taking advantage of us for this very long time when you talk about the US. Because, yeah, but again, by design, because that's how it was built, didn't China really identify this issue? When you go right back to the global financial crisis, they were really highlighting some of these issues that are now front and center. I mean, it's not a recent phenomenon that this is a problem. It seems to be now the US is focused on it. All of a sudden, it becomes everyone else's problem. But it has been a problem for a long time.
Yeah, back during the GFC, I'm going to say his name wrong, so I'm not going to attempt it. But the governor of the People's Bank of China basically said the reason the GFC has happened is because of the Triffin Dilemma, and he's kind of right. Like asset prices and over speculation in the US market inflated asset prices. When that started to deflate, the US needed their dollars back, so they started pulling it back from overseas and took all the liquidity out of the world market, collapsed asset prices worldwide. Basically, the Triffin Dilemma means that US asset prices have to always appreciate. And so if you've got any speculation in any market, like, I don't know, the Magnificent Seven or property prices during 2008, if they deflate, unless liquidity is put back into the market, it's contagious across the world.
And as I said, by design, right? Like that, or not necessarily intentional that they want the negative impact that comes down the road, but they benefit from the fact that it has to keep prices going up. It's certainly helped the US exceptionalism story exist for a long period of time.
But you could argue as well, like Trump's not wrong that
No.
manufacturing's left the US, and it has because it artificially inflates the value of the US dollar. So it has taken jobs away from people in the US. You can't get away from that. If they're running constant deficits, they're spending more than what they make. Therefore, their dollar is overvalued.
And this is my issue with it, because when I say the by design, cheekily, it's this idea that you get to benefit from that for a period of time, but there are costs. There's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to international trade, and those costs are now coming home in the form of the manufacturing is just not there, and the capacity to do that's not there. You've got to build it from scratch effectively. I mean, this all really started with that, as you highlight regularly, the Nixon shock, the idea that we jump off the gold standard because ultimately that was creating its own set of issues. When you look back at that retrospectively, was that the right decision here? Like, was it essential that it went that way? Do we need to go back to something like that? How do you think about that pivot?
I mean, the pivot during the Nixon shock was just getting away from Bretton Woods, which was fundamentally a collapse of a reserve currency, which, again, fundamentally looks like it's going on in a slower way now. So the reason it's happening in a slower way now is because central banks have worked out they can buy their own debt and put liquidity into the market that way. So it's a slower train wreck, which is why you've got diminishing interest rates, because the interest rates have to come off at the same time that debt goes up, because otherwise countries like the US can't afford it. Now, we've had a period of zero. There's not many places left to hide before this collapses. And so if you look back at, what Nixon did, well, I mean, he fixed the problem then. But even during Bretton Woods, they already had the solution. Keynes basically said you need to float all currencies, you need to have a medium in the middle in order to do it, to adjust adjust currencies and foreign exchange, so that when one country is producing a lot and they're running a surplus, well, their dollar needs to go down. Which way are we going? Up in value in order to get back down to a neutral to deficit sort of level. So the solution's always been there, but it's never been implemented. And maybe that was because things weren't global back then. Well, things are global now, and they're going to have to do something about it, because the US turning to not wanting to run deficits anymore basically means US dollars have to be bought back into the US. So it's going to deflate asset prices around the world, and no government in the world is going to like that. So they're going to fight back. So it's, something needs to be put in the middle pretty soon, or there's going to be a lot more conflict.
And I think to wrap this up, that really is the ultimate solution here. Something needs to be in the middle. A lot of people will argue, and I mean, I would probably be on that side as well, that gold has a role to play, at least a partial role to play in what that should be. It has been convenient to be the US dollar for a whole raft of reasons. And if that's not going to be the case anymore, what do we replace it with? It makes no sense to just replace it with another. Like, you don't replace it with the yuan for multiple reasons, but you don't replace it with the yuan because you're in the exact same situation. You've just shifted, kicked the can to another country. It needs a fundamental redesign. How do you think about the solutions here? Do you think the same way, that gold ends up being part of the solution, or does it have to be something entirely different? I mean, there's always the floated idea of things like central bank digital currencies, but a lot of people are not keen on that idea.
So Bancor is not a currency, I guess. It's a medium to adjust, exchange rates. So gold could be used as the payment between countries for the penalty, I guess. So you're not backing a currency fully by gold, right? What you are actually doing is just saying, okay, you're running a deficit, you need to pay, it's 1%. And that might be gold. So that gold can transfer, but that's not a currency in itself. The currency is, something like a crypto, really, that is there. And if you've got 100-unit deficit, maybe you pay 1 unit of gold. So the whole deficit of 100 units doesn't need to be backed by gold. It becomes marginal as gold as a payment method. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's what's so interesting about looking at it through the lens that you always look at it through, that historical lens where you bring it all together, because it's not like the solution wasn't already there. So you're talking about since the 70s, we had solutions.
No, 40s.
Well, even earlier, that's right. But like the choices that were made in the 70s sent us down a particular path. And right, even then, there would have been debates around this going, well.
You talk about history not repeating itself. This has not been used. So this is actually something new that someone might try. You never know, it might cause its own issues. Like every time there's a solution, it's corruptible or it doesn't work and you've got to start again. But what we've been doing for the last 150 years is rinse and repeat. We've done it. We did it when Britain was the reserve, when the UK had the reserve currency. We've done it now twice or 3 times in the US. It's not working. The outcome is always the same. It is not going to change. So it's time to try something new. And a solution was put forward a long time ago.
Absolutely fascinating. Be interesting to see if that comes into the discussion anywhere in these trade talks and things that are going on at the moment, whether they actually think about that or whether they just attack each other. We'll see how it unfolds, because there's a little bit of intellect and a little bit of bravery required there, I think, to really change the system at that level.
We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, thanks as always, Alex. Love your work on this. Love your deep dives. It really gives us some excellent perspective to think all this through under that framework. So thank you.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.